They said it was just another perfect night, until everything fell apart in less than 3 seconds. The crystal chandelier above the ballroom shimmered like frozen light, scattering reflections across polished marble floors as waiters in black tuxedos moved quietly between tables, their silver trays balanced with precision, the soft hum of a string quartet filling the air with something that almost felt like peace, and in the center of it all stood Emily Carter, 8 months pregnant. One hand resting gently against the curve of her belly, the other holding a delicate champagne glass she hadn't touched, her pale blue gown flowing softly around her like a promise of something fragile and hopeful, because tonight was supposed to be about appearances, about smiles for cameras, about proving that everything in her life was still intact, still beautiful, still worth envying. But if you looked closely, closer than anyone in that room cared to, you would have seen the tension in her shoulders. The way her breath came just a second too slow, the way her eyes searched not for admiration, but for reassurance, for something real in a room built entirely on illusion, and across from her stood Adrian Whitmore, a man whose name alone carried weight in boardrooms and headlines, his tailored suit flawless, his expression controlled, his presence commanding in a way that made people step aside without knowing why, and beside him, just half a step too close, was Sabrina Hale. Her red dress catching the light like a warning no one wanted to read, her smile sharp, deliberate, practiced. The kind that didn't belong in a room celebrating charity and compassion, and somewhere between the polite applause and the quiet clinking of glass, something shifted, something subtle but irreversible, like a crack forming beneath ice, because Emily heard it then, not a word meant for her, not a confession, but enough, just enough to understand that the life she thought she was holding together had already been rewritten without her. And for a moment she didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even breathe, the world around her continuing in slow, elegant motion as if nothing had changed, as if nothing ever would. But then Adrian turned, his expression tightening in a way only she would recognize, a warning disguised as control, and what happened next wasn't loud, it wasn't chaotic. It wasn't the kind of moment people expect when everything breaks. It was quiet, almost invisible, the kind of shift that makes a room go still without anyone understanding why, a glass slipping, a breath catching, a silence spreading like something alive, and in that silence, Emily's hand moved instinctively to her stomach, her fingers pressing lightly as if to reassure the life inside her that everything was still safe, still steady, still under control. Even as the ground beneath her began to disappear, and somewhere near her feet, unnoticed by most, a small white baby shoe, soft, untouched, waiting for a future that hadn't arrived yet, slid from her clutch and landed against the cold marble floor, a quiet detail in a room full of noise, the kind of detail no one remembers until it's too late, until the story has already changed, until the truth begins to surface piece by piece, and by the time anyone realized something was wrong, it was already too late to pretend it wasn't. The ambulance doors closed with a hollow metallic thud that seemed louder than it should have been, sealing Emily inside a narrow space filled with white light, controlled voices, and the steady, mechanical rhythm of machines that measured things she could not see but could somehow feel slipping away. And as the vehicle pulled into motion, the city lights blurred past the small rear window like streaks of something distant and unreachable, while a paramedic adjusted a monitor near her shoulder, speaking in calm, practiced tones that carried urgency beneath their surface, and Emily tried to focus on the only thing that mattered, her hand still resting protectively over her abdomen, her fingers trembling slightly as if waiting for reassurance from within, for movement, for a sign that everything was still intact, still salvageable, still hers. But the silence beneath her palm felt heavier than anything she had ever known. And she swallowed, her throat dry, her voice barely more than a breath as she asked the question that refused to stay unspoken, asking if her baby was all right, asking it again when no one answered immediately, asking it a third time with a fragile insistence that made one of the paramedics glance at the other before offering a response that sounded careful rather than certain, telling her they were doing everything they could, telling her to stay calm, telling her to breathe. And Emily nodded even though the words did not settle the fear that had already taken root, because somewhere deep inside she understood that something had changed, something irreversible, something that no amount of calm instructions could undo, and as the ambulance turned sharply, The motion sent a soft tremor through her body, her gaze drifting toward the ceiling where fluorescent lights flickered slightly with each bump in the road. And she found herself remembering the nursery she had been preparing just days ago, the pale yellow walls, the crib that had taken hours to assemble, the tiny folded clothes arranged with quiet anticipation, each piece chosen with care, each detail a promise of a future she had believed was certain, and now that future felt distant, like a story she had once heard but could no longer fully recall. And outside, sirens cut through traffic, clearing a path that felt both urgent and isolating, separating her from everything familiar, everything safe, everything she thought she understood about her life. And for a brief moment, her mind drifted back to the ballroom, to the faces that had turned, to the silence that had spread, to Adrian's expression that had not matched the gravity of what was happening, controlled, distant, almost inconvenienced, as though the disruption mattered more than the cause. And that memory settled into her chest with a weight she could not name, because it was not just fear anymore. It was realization, a slow, unfolding awareness that the life she had been living was built on something far more fragile than she had ever allowed herself to see. And as the ambulance began to slow, the bright lights of the hospital entrance coming into view, Emily closed her eyes for a single second, holding on to whatever hope remained, however small, however uncertain, as if by doing so she could keep something from slipping beyond reach. But when the doors opened and the cold night air rushed in, that hope felt thinner, quieter, like a whisper fading into the noise, and as hands guided her forward and voices called out instructions she could not fully process, one thought echoed clearly above all the rest, not loud, not dramatic, but steady and unrelenting, a question that had no immediate answer and yet refused to disappear. A question that would follow her through every moment that came next, asking not just what had happened, but what it would cost, and whether anything she had lost could ever truly be returned. The hospital doors burst open into a flood of fluorescent light that erased the night completely, replacing it with something sterile, controlled, and unforgivingly real. And as Emily was rushed through a corridor lined with identical white walls and indistinct faces, the sounds around her sharpened into fragments. Clipped instructions, the rolling squeak of wheels, the steady beeping of monitors that seemed to mark time in a way that felt both precise and unbearable, and then everything slowed. Not because the urgency faded, but because her awareness narrowed to a single point, the rhythm beneath her hand, the space where movement should have been, where reassurance should have answered her without words, and it did not, and that absence followed her into the examination room where the lights were brighter, colder, more revealing than anything she had experienced before, and Dr. Melissa Shaw appeared at her side. Her voice calm but focused, her presence steady in a way that suggested experience with moments exactly like this, moments where everything balanced on a line too thin to see, and Emily searched her face for answers before any were spoken, reading the subtle tension in her eyes, the careful pacing of her words, the way she avoided certainty until she could not, and time stretched, measured not in minutes but in breaths, in glances. In the quiet hum of machines that seemed to fill the silence with something heavier than sound, and then the moment arrived, not with drama, not with raised voices, but with a softness that made it harder to bear, because Dr. Shaw spoke gently, clearly, choosing each word as though it carried weight beyond language itself, explaining that despite every effort, despite immediate intervention, despite everything that had been done, the baby could not be saved, and for a second Emily did not react, not because she did not understand, but because understanding arrived too completely, too suddenly, leaving no room for denial, no space to negotiate with reality, just a stillness that settled over her like something final. And the room did not change, the lights did not dim, the machines did not stop, everything continued exactly as it had before, which somehow made the truth feel even more impossible. Because how could the world remain unchanged when everything inside her had shifted so completely? And somewhere beyond the room, footsteps approached, measured and deliberate, carrying a presence that felt different from the hurried urgency of the staff, and when the door opened, Nathan Carter stepped inside, his coat still damp from the night air, his posture straight, his expression composed in a way that concealed more than it revealed, but his eyes moved quickly, taking in every detail, the equipment, the doctor, his daughter lying still beneath the thin hospital blanket, and then he saw her face, and something in his own changed, not outwardly, not in a way anyone else might notice, but enough for Emily to recognize it instantly, because she had seen that look only once before, years ago, when something irreversible had happened and there had been no words strong enough to contain it, and he walked to her side without hesitation, without asking permission. His presence grounding in a way nothing else in that room could be, and he did not speak immediately, did not ask questions, did not demand explanations. He simply stood there, one hand resting lightly against the edge of the bed, as if anchoring himself to the moment, and Emily turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze, and in that silent exchange everything passed between them, the loss, the realization, the unspoken understanding that what had happened could not be undone, and outside the room, the hospital continued its steady rhythm. Unaware or unwilling to pause, while inside, something far more profound had already begun to take shape, not loud, not visible, but certain, like a decision forming beneath the surface, waiting for the moment it would no longer remain unspoken. Morning did not arrive the way it was supposed to. There was no warmth, no sense of renewal, only a pale gray light filtering through the hospital blinds, flattening everything it touched into something distant and muted, and Emily lay still beneath the thin blanket, her eyes open but unfocused, as if she were watching a version of her life that no longer belonged to her, while Nathan Carter remained seated beside her, unchanged in posture, unchanged in presence, as though time itself had slowed around him, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low, measured, carrying none of the anger one might expect, only a quiet certainty that made it heavier, asking her not what had happened, because he already understood enough, but how long it had been this way, and the question lingered between them for a moment before Emily answered, not in detail, not with dramatic confession, but with small, precise truths that revealed far more than any explanation could, the way Adrian had begun deciding things for her without asking, the way conversations had turned into instructions, the way apologies came without change, the way her world had gradually narrowed until she could not remember when she had last made a decision that felt entirely her own, and as she spoke, her voice remained steady, almost detached, as if recounting someone else's story, because the reality of it had become too large to process all at once, and Nathan listened without interruption, his gaze fixed, absorbing each piece, building a picture not from a single moment but from a pattern, from repetition, from the quiet accumulation of control that often goes unnoticed until it is too late, and outside the room, the day began to move forward. Nurses changing shifts, carts rolling past, conversations starting and stopping in the hallway, while inside, something far more deliberate was taking shape, not rushed, not reactive, but calculated, because Nathan Carter was not a man who acted on impulse, he was a man who observed, who waited, who understood that the truth, when revealed at the right moment, carried more power than any immediate reaction. And when Emily finally fell silent, her energy drained not from emotion but from the effort of speaking at all, Nathan reached into the pocket of his coat and placed something gently on the small table beside her bed, the tiny white baby shoe that had been recovered from the ballroom floor, now clean but unmistakably marked by what it represented, and for the first time since she had arrived at the hospital, Emily's composure faltered, not outwardly, not in a way that would draw attention, but in the way her fingers moved slightly toward it, hovering just above the surface, without touching, as if contact would make the loss undeniable in a way she was not yet ready to face, and Nathan watched that moment carefully, not intruding, not offering comfort in the form of words that would feel insufficient, because he understood that some losses could not be softened, only acknowledged, and after a long silence, he spoke again, this time not as a father trying to console his daughter, but as a man who had reached a conclusion he could not ignore, asking her one question, clear and direct, whether she wanted this to be the end of the story or the beginning of something else, and Emily did not answer immediately, her gaze still fixed on the small shoe, her thoughts moving slowly but with growing clarity, because somewhere beneath the grief, beneath the exhaustion, beneath everything that had been taken from her, something else had begun to emerge, something steady, something unyielding, and when she finally looked up at him, there were no tears, no hesitation, only a quiet resolve that had not been there before, and in that moment, Nathan Carter understood that whatever came next would not be driven by anger alone, but by something far more enduring, something that would not fade with time, something that had already begun to reshape the path ahead. The room remained quiet long after the decision had been made, but outside those walls the world did not slow down, and by late afternoon the first version of the story had already begun to take shape without Emily's voice in it, carefully polished statements circulating through media outlets, describing the incident at the gala as an unfortunate misunderstanding, a moment taken out of context. A narrative softened by language designed to protect reputation rather than reveal truth, and Adrian Whitmore, ever composed, had already positioned himself at the center of that narrative, issuing a brief comment through his public relations team expressing concern for his wife's health while subtly distancing himself from any suggestion of responsibility, the wording precise, deliberate, crafted to suggest sympathy without accountability, and as those statements spread, they carried the weight of his influence. His name opening doors, shaping conversations, guiding perception before facts. Had a chance to settle, and in the hospital room, Nathan Carter listened to a recording of one such broadcast on his phone, his expression unchanged, his focus absolute, because he understood something most people did not, that the first version of a story is rarely the truth, but it is often the one that decides everything if left unchallenged, and he set the phone down slowly, his gaze shifting toward Emily, who had not moved from her position, her attention still drawn intermittently to the small white shoe resting on the table, as though it anchored her to something that could not be rewritten by public statements or carefully chosen words, and when Nathan spoke, his voice carried a new tone, not louder, not harsher, but sharper, more defined, as if each word had been weighed before being allowed to exist, explaining that what Adrian had started was not just damage control, it was strategy, and strategy could only be countered with something stronger. Something undeniable, something that could not be dismissed as interpretation. And Emily listened, her silence no longer empty but attentive, absorbing not just what he said but what it implied, because this was no longer about a single moment, it was about everything that had led to it, everything that had been hidden behind polished appearances and controlled narratives. And Nathan continued, outlining the next steps with calm precision, mentioning names, investigators, legal counsel. People who did not operate in headlines but in facts, people who understood how to uncover patterns, timelines, evidence that could not be explained away, and with each detail, the path ahead became clearer, not easier, not less painful, but clearer, and for the first time since the hospital doors had closed behind her, Emily felt something shift inside her that was not grief, not fear, but something steadier, something that resembled control returning in small, deliberate increments. And she reached for the shoe then, her fingers finally making contact, holding it with a quiet care that spoke louder than any words, because it was no longer just a reminder of what she had lost, it was a measure of what had been taken, and what could not be allowed to disappear into silence. And Nathan watched her closely, not intervening, not guiding, simply confirming what he already knew, that she had crossed the threshold that could not be reversed. And when she finally looked up at him, her voice was still soft, but it carried a clarity that had not been there before, asking not what they would do, but how far they would go, and Nathan answered without hesitation, without dramatics, with a certainty that settled into the room like something immovable, telling her they would go as far as the truth required, no further, no less. And in that moment, the balance of the story began to shift, not in public, not yet, but in a way that would eventually reach far beyond that hospital room, because what had started as a controlled narrative was about to meet something it could not contain. By the time night settled over the city again, the narrative outside the hospital had already begun to fracture, not visibly, not enough for the public to notice, but beneath the surface where influence met resistance, where carefully constructed stories encountered questions they could not immediately silence, and in a quiet office 3 floors below the intensive care wing. Olivia Grant reviewed the first set of materials Nathan had requested, her expression focused, her movements precise, as she sorted through timelines, guest lists, internal communications from the gala, each detail forming part of a larger pattern that was beginning to reveal itself, not through dramatic discovery, but through consistency, through repetition, through the subtle alignment of facts that no longer supported the version of events being presented to the world, and when she finally looked up, her voice carried the calm certainty of someone who understood exactly what she was seeing, explaining that the incident at the gala was not isolated, that there were discrepancies in Adrian Whitmore's statements, inconsistencies in how the evening had been described, and more importantly, indications that certain elements had been anticipated, controlled, or at the very least, strategically minimized, and Nathan listened without interruption, his attention fixed, absorbing each point with the same deliberate focus he had shown from the beginning, because for him this was no longer about emotion, it was about structure, about dismantling something piece by piece until nothing false remained standing, and upstairs, Emily remained in her room, unaware of the specific details being uncovered but fully aware that something had shifted beyond her immediate view, because the silence around her no longer felt empty, it felt active, like a space where decisions were being made, where movement was happening just out of sight. And she found herself replaying the moments leading up to that night, not searching for blame, not trying to rewrite the past, but recognizing patterns she had once dismissed, conversations that had seemed insignificant at the time but now carried new meaning, the way Adrian had insisted on controlling the guest list, the way Sabrina had appeared without explanation, the way certain interactions had felt rehearsed rather than spontaneous. And each memory added weight to a realization that was becoming harder to ignore, that what had happened was not simply a moment gone wrong, but part of something more deliberate, something that had been allowed to exist because she had trusted the wrong version of reality for too long, and that understanding did not bring immediate clarity, but it did bring direction, a sense that whatever came next would not be about reacting, but about revealing, about allowing the truth to surface in a way that could not be reshaped or redirected. And as the hours passed, Nathan returned to her room, his presence unchanged but his purpose now fully defined, and he did not begin with explanation, he began with a question, asking her to remember anything unusual from the weeks leading up to the gala, anything that had felt out of place even if it had seemed minor at the time, and Emily considered this carefully, her thoughts moving slower than before but with increasing precision, recalling details she had not previously connected, small shifts in routine, conversations that ended abruptly when she entered the room, the way Adrian had become more attentive in public while more distant in private, the subtle but undeniable sense that appearances had begun to matter more than reality. And as she spoke, Nathan listened, not just to the words, but to the patterns within them, building a framework that extended beyond a single night, and when she finished, he nodded once, not in agreement, but in confirmation. Because what they were uncovering was no longer uncertain, it was structured, intentional, and most importantly, provable. And as he stood to leave, he paused briefly, his gaze settling on the small white shoe still resting in Emily's hand, and in that moment, without needing to say it aloud, both of them understood that this was no longer about reclaiming what had been lost, it was about ensuring that nothing else would be hidden again. 2 days later, the hospital room no longer felt like a place of shock, it had become something else entirely, a quiet command center where silence carried intention and every conversation mattered, and by then the first real cracks in Adrian Whitmore's carefully constructed narrative had begun to surface, not through headlines yet, but through questions from people who had seen too much to ignore. Guests from the gala who remembered details that did not align with the official version, staff members who noticed timing that felt rehearsed rather than spontaneous, and most importantly, a piece of footage that had not been part of the original story at all, a security angle from the far end of the ballroom that captured more than Adrian had accounted for, more than anyone had initially reviewed, and Olivia Grant stood in front of a screen in a dimly lit conference room, replaying that footage frame by frame, her focus absolute, her expression unreadable, as she traced movements, distances, interactions that told a different story when viewed without narration, without interpretation, just raw sequence, and when she paused the video, she leaned back slightly, not in surprise, but in recognition, because this was the kind of detail that changed everything, the kind that could not be dismissed as perspective or misunderstanding. And when Nathan arrived, she did not need to explain immediately, she simply restarted the clip, letting it speak for itself, and as the images unfolded, the gap between what had been claimed, and what had actually occurred became impossible to ignore, not dramatic, not exaggerated, but precise, controlled, undeniable, and Nathan watched without comment, his attention fixed on every second, every shift, every moment that had been overlooked or intentionally excluded, and when the clip ended, he nodded once, not as acknowledgement of what had happened, but as confirmation of what could now be proven. And upstairs, Emily sat by the window, the pale afternoon light casting long shadows across the floor, her reflection faintly visible in the glass, and for the first time since everything had changed, she allowed herself to think not just about what had been lost, but about what had been hidden, about the layers of her life that had been shaped without her full awareness, and she realized something that settled deeply within her, something that did not bring comfort but brought clarity. That the truth had always been there in fragments, in moments she had dismissed, in instincts she had quieted, and now those fragments were coming together whether she was ready or not. And when Nathan returned to her room later that evening, there was a subtle difference in the air, something more defined, more directed, and he did not begin with explanation, he began with certainty, telling her that they now had something Adrian could not control, something that existed outside of statements and influence. Something that could not be rewritten. Once revealed, and Emily listened, her expression calm but focused, because she understood what that meant, not just legally, but personally, that the version of events she had lived through was about to be seen without distortion, without protection, and for a brief moment she looked down at the small white shoe resting beside her, her fingers brushing lightly against it as if grounding herself in its presence. And then she looked back at Nathan, her voice steady, asking one simple question. Not whether it would change things, but when it would begin, and Nathan answered with the same measured clarity he had shown from the start, telling her that timing was no longer about waiting, it was about precision, about choosing the moment when the truth would not just appear, but resonate. And as the evening settled in once more, the distance between what had been hidden and what was about to be revealed grew smaller with every passing hour, until it was no longer a question of if, but of how much would change when it finally did. The next morning began not with urgency, but with quiet preparation, the kind that happens before something irreversible is set into motion, and in a glass-walled conference room overlooking the city, Olivia Grant laid out the full sequence for the first time, every piece aligned, every detail accounted for, the security footage, the timeline discrepancies, the internal communications from Adrian's team that revealed subtle but consistent efforts to control the narrative before it even began. And Nathan stood across from her, his posture unchanged, his focus absolute, as he reviewed each element not as a reaction to what had happened, but as a structure that would determine what happened next, because for him, this was no longer about exposing a single moment, it was about revealing a pattern that could not be dismissed once seen in its entirety. And Olivia pointed to the key element. The footage that captured not just the event itself, but the seconds before, the positioning, the proximity, the awareness that contradicted Adrian's version of surprise and confusion, and she explained that timing would be critical, that releasing it too early would allow room for deflection, for reinterpretation, but releasing it at the right moment, in the right context, would leave no space for anything but acknowledgement, and Nathan nodded once, understanding that precision was not about speed, it was about impact, and across the city, Adrian Whitmore prepared for his own version of control, stepping into a carefully arranged press briefing designed to reinforce his narrative, his legal team standing just behind him, his tone measured, his words chosen with the same calculated care that had defined his public image for years, expressing concern, emphasizing misunderstanding, subtly guiding the audience toward a version of events that minimized everything that could not be easily defended, and for a brief moment, it seemed to work, the room attentive, the questions controlled, the narrative holding together just enough to maintain its shape. But in another location, just outside that controlled environment, Olivia and her team watched the broadcast in real time, waiting not for the end, but for the precise moment when the foundation of that narrative was strongest. Because that was when it would break most completely, and Nathan stood beside them, silent, his attention fixed on the screen, not on Adrian's words, but on the timing, the rhythm, the exact point where confidence turned into vulnerability. And then it came, a question from a reporter that opened the door just enough, asking about inconsistencies in eyewitness accounts, a question Adrian attempted to redirect with practiced ease, and that was the moment Olivia had been waiting for. The signal that the narrative had reached its peak, and within seconds, the prepared release was activated. The footage sent simultaneously to major outlets, legal channels, and internal stakeholders who had been given no prior access, and as the video began to circulate, the shift was immediate, not chaotic, not explosive, but unmistakable, the tone in the room changing, the questions no longer controlled. The certainty in Adrian's responses beginning to fracture under the weight of something he could not reinterpret in real time, and in the hospital room, Emily sat quietly, unaware of the exact second it happened but aware that something had changed, because her phone, which had remained silent for days, began to vibrate with incoming messages, notifications, fragments of a world that was finally beginning to reflect what she had lived through, and she did not reach for it immediately, she did not need to, because she could feel it, the shift, the moment when the story was no longer his to control. And when Nathan entered the room minutes later, he did not need to. Absence of the confusion that had been claimed, and as she set the phone down, there was no dramatic reaction, no visible release, just a quiet exhale, a subtle shift in the way she held herself, as if something internal had finally settled into place, and when Nathan entered moments later, he did not ask what she had seen, he already knew. Because the ripple effect had reached every level of the structure they had anticipated, and he explained calmly that this was only the beginning, that exposure did not end with visibility, it extended into consequence, into decisions that would now be made by people who could no longer claim uncertainty. And Emily listened, her gaze steady, because she understood that this was not about immediate resolution, it was about momentum, about a shift that would continue to unfold long after the initial moment had passed. And she glanced once more at the small white shoe resting beside her, her fingers brushing against it with a sense of purpose, rather than hesitation, because it no longer represented something lost in silence, it represented something that had forced the truth into the open, and outside the hospital, the narrative continued to change with every passing minute, not because it was being rewritten, but because it was finally being seen for what it had always been, and in that space between exposure and consequence, the balance of power moved quietly but definitively, leaving behind no room for denial, only the unfolding weight of what came next. By late afternoon the consequences began to move beyond screens and statements, shifting into decisions that carried weight in places Adrian Whitmore could no longer reach with a single call or carefully chosen word, and in a high-rise boardroom overlooking the financial district, the members of his executive board sat in silence as the footage played once more, not as speculation, not as rumor, but as evidence that demanded response, and one by one the conversations that followed were no longer about loyalty or image, they were about liability, about trust, about whether a man who had built his empire on control could still be trusted to lead it when that control had so visibly fractured, and outside that room, legal teams worked in parallel, reviewing contracts, clauses, exposure points that had once seemed theoretical but were now immediate, and within hours, the first official statement was drafted, not by Adrian's team, but by the company itself, creating distance where there had once been alignment, signaling a separation that would have been unthinkable just days before, and in another part of the city, Sabrina Hale watched the same shift unfold from a very different perspective, her phone lighting up not with admiration but with scrutiny, messages no longer flattering but questioning. And for the first time, the confidence she had carried so effortlessly began to falter, because the narrative she had relied on was no longer stable, no longer protected, and without that protection, her position became something else entirely, something exposed, something vulnerable to the same truth that was now reaching every corner of the story. And back at the hospital, Emily listened as Nathan outlined the next phase, his voice steady, his approach unchanged, explaining that public exposure created pressure, but pressure alone was not enough, it had to be directed. It had to be sustained, it had to be translated into actions that could not be reversed once initiated, and he described the legal filings already in motion, the formal complaints that would move the matter from public discourse into structured accountability, where statements were no longer persuasive but provable, and Emily absorbed each detail with a calm that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. Because the chaos that had once surrounded her had been replaced by something more defined, something that moved with purpose rather than reaction, and when Nathan finished, he did not ask for approval, he did not need to, because the decision had already been made in that quiet moment when she chose not to look away, and as evening approached, the hospital room once again filled with that familiar stillness. But it no longer carried uncertainty, it carried momentum. A sense that events were unfolding beyond the limits of any single person's control, and Emily stood slowly, moving toward the window for the first time since she had arrived, the city stretching out before her in lines of light and motion, unchanged in appearance but altered in meaning, because somewhere within that landscape, the structures that had once supported Adrian Whitmore were beginning to shift, not dramatically, not all at once, but in ways that could not be undone once they began, and she held the small white shoe in her hand, not tightly, not with desperation, but with a quiet steadiness that reflected the change within her, because what it represented had already shaped everything that followed, and as she looked out across the city, she understood that the story was no longer about what had been taken from her, it was about what would now be revealed to everyone else, and in that realization, there was no satisfaction, no sense of victory. Only a clear and unwavering awareness that the truth, once set in motion, would carry its own weight. And that weight was already beginning to fall exactly where it needed to. The formal proceedings did not begin with raised voices or dramatic confrontation, they began with silence, the kind that settles over a room where every person understands that what is about to happen cannot be undone, and inside a polished courtroom lined with dark wood and filtered light, Adrian Whitmore sat at the defense table, his posture still composed, his suit still immaculate. But the certainty that once defined him no longer carried the same weight, because across from him, Olivia Grant organized her materials with quiet precision, each document placed exactly where it needed to be, each piece of evidence aligned not for effect, but for clarity, and in the gallery, observers filled the seats not out of curiosity, but because the story had already reached them, because what had once been private had become something public, something that now demanded a formal reckoning. And when the proceedings began, there were no theatrics, only structure, only process, questions asked, answers given, statements reviewed, but beneath that controlled rhythm, something else unfolded, something far more consequential, because with each detail presented, with each inconsistency highlighted, the gap between Adrian's version of events and the documented reality widened in a way that could not be reconciled, and when the footage was introduced, not as a surprise but as part of a deliberate sequence, the room did not react outwardly, there were no audible gasps, no visible shock, but the shift was unmistakable, the kind that changes the way people sit, the way they look at one another, the way they begin to understand that what they are witnessing is no longer a matter of interpretation, but of fact, and Adrian's response, when it came, was measured, controlled, but no longer definitive. Because the questions he faced were no longer about perception, they were about alignment, about whether his statements matched what could be seen, what could be verified, what could not be explained away, and as that pressure built, not dramatically, but steadily, his control over the narrative continued to erode, not in a single moment, but in a sequence of realizations that left less and less room for defense, and in the back of the room, Nathan Carter sat without movement. His presence quiet but unyielding, observing not just the proceedings, but the progression, the way truth, when structured correctly, did not need force to be effective, it needed only to be presented in a way that could not be ignored, and miles away, in the hospital room that had become a place of transition rather than confinement, Emily listened to a live audio feed, her expression calm, her attention focused, because this was no longer something happening to her. It was something unfolding because of her. Because of what she had chosen not to conceal, and as the hearing continued, she found herself not reacting to individual moments, but understanding the pattern as a whole, the way each piece connected, the way each question led to the next, until the structure of the truth stood on its own, no longer needing explanation, and when the session paused, not with resolution but with direction, it was clear to everyone present that the outcome had already begun to take shape. Not as a verdict, but as an inevitability, And in that space between process and conclusion, the balance that had once favored Adrian Whitmore shifted entirely, leaving behind not uncertainty, but the quiet, irreversible weight of accountability moving steadily toward its final form. The final stage did not arrive with a single announcement, or a dramatic turning point. It unfolded through a series of decisions that carried more weight than any declaration ever could, and in the days that followed the hearing, the consequences extended beyond the courtroom into every structure that had once supported Adrian Whitmore. His company issuing a formal separation statement that removed him from all executive authority, not as a temporary measure, but as a permanent action designed to preserve what remained of its credibility, and investors who had once defended him publicly now withdrew their support quietly but decisively, their silence speaking louder than any endorsement ever had, while legal proceedings advanced with a steady momentum that no longer relied on speculation, only on documentation, testimony, and the alignment of facts that had already begun to define the outcome, and across media platforms, the narrative that had once been controlled now moved independently, no longer guided by statements but by evidence that required no interpretation, and in that shift, Sabrina Hale found herself increasingly isolated. Her association with Adrian no longer a position of influence, but a liability that distanced her from the very circles she had once navigated with ease, her presence fading from public view not by choice but by necessity, and in the hospital, where everything had begun to change, Emily prepared to leave for the first time, not as someone escaping a moment of crisis, but as someone stepping into a new phase defined by clarity rather than confusion, and as she gathered her belongings, her movements were deliberate, unhurried. As if acknowledging that this transition was not about returning to what had been, but about moving forward with something fundamentally altered, and Nathan stood nearby, his presence steady as it had been from the beginning, not guiding, not directing, simply ensuring that the path ahead remained unobstructed, and when the final documents were presented to Emily, outlining the legal outcomes that had already been set in motion, she reviewed them carefully, not searching for validation, but for understanding, for the confirmation that what had been hidden was now formally recognized, that what had been denied was now documented, and when she signed, her hand did not tremble, her expression did not change, because this was not a moment of victory. It was a moment of completion, the closing of something that had once defined her life, and as she stood at the doorway of the hospital room one last time, her gaze moved briefly across the space that had held both loss and transformation, before settling on the small white shoe resting in her hand, its presence unchanged but its meaning entirely different, no longer a symbol of something that had been taken without acknowledgement, but a reminder that the truth had been carried through to its end. And outside, the city continued as it always had, unaware of the details but shaped nonetheless by the outcome, because the fall of a man like Adrian Whitmore did not happen in isolation, it echoed through systems, through decisions, through the quiet recalibration of power that followed, and as Emily stepped forward, leaving the hospital behind, she did not look back, not because the past no longer mattered, but because it had already given her everything she needed to move beyond it. And in that quiet departure, the story reached a point where nothing more needed to be proven, only lived. Weeks passed without announcement, without spectacle, without the kind of noise that usually follows the fall of someone once considered untouchable, and in that absence of attention, something far more lasting took shape, because the world had already moved on to its next headline, its next story, its next version of urgency. But for Emily Carter, what remained was not what the public had seen. It was what had been changed permanently beneath the surface, and on a quiet morning in a house that no longer felt like a memory but like something newly her own, she stood in a small room with soft light filtering through sheer curtains, a room that had once been prepared with expectation and hope, now transformed into something quieter, something more intentional, and on a simple wooden shelf near the window sat a small box, unmarked, unadorned, its presence subtle but deliberate, and Emily approached it slowly. Not out of hesitation, but out of respect for what it held, and when she opened it, the small white baby shoe rested inside exactly as she had placed it, unchanged, untouched, its meaning no longer tied to the moment it had fallen, but to everything that had followed, everything it had carried forward when she could not, and she did not cry, she did not speak, she simply stood there, allowing the silence to exist without needing to fill it, because some truths do not require words, they require acknowledgement. And in that stillness, she understood something that had taken time to fully settle, that what had been taken from her would always matter, but it would not define the entirety of her life, not anymore. And outside, the world continued in its usual rhythm, cars passing, distant voices, the ordinary movement of a day that held no awareness of the weight contained within that small room. And across the city, Adrian Whitmore's name no longer carried the same power it once had. Mentioned only in passing, in legal summaries, in business case studies that spoke not of success, but of consequence, his influence reduced not by force, but by the absence of trust that could not be restored once broken. And Nathan Carter, standing in the doorway, did not interrupt the moment, did not step inside, because he understood that this was not something to be shared, it was something to be witnessed from a distance. And after a few seconds, Emily closed the box gently, her movements calm, her expression steady, and when she turned, there was no visible trace of the person who had once stood in that ballroom searching for reassurance in a room full of illusions, because what replaced her was not hardened, not closed, but clear, defined by an understanding that could not be taken away again. And as she walked past Nathan, their eyes met briefly, no words exchanged, none needed, because everything that had been said, everything that had been done, had already led them here. And as she stepped out into the light of a new day, there was no sense of triumph, no dramatic conclusion, only a quiet certainty that some people lose everything they built not because of what they did in public, but because of what they chose to hide in private. And in the end, it is not power that decides the outcome, it is truth, revealed at the moment. It can no longer be ignored.